Hello and welcome to Superfund at 40, Part 2, The Future of Superfund. Has the mission expanded and will it be permanent? My name is Caitlin McCarthy and I'm the Director of Education, Associates, and Corporate Partnerships here at the Environmental Law Institute. I am delighted to welcome everyone to this public webinar co-sponsored with Beverage and Diamond. At the end of today's webinar, we will have time for a questions and answer session. On GoToWebinar, please submit your questions using GoTo's question box. And please do not wait until the end. Send your questions as soon as you think of them. I would like to take a moment to thank our outstanding panelists for joining us today to lend their expertise to this webinar. While they will be introduced briefly momentarily, the full speaker bios are posted on our website, eli.org, and I would encourage you to check out their expertise in more detail there. I would also like to thank the Beverage and Diamond team for their many efforts putting together today's program, especially Benjamin Apple, John Cruden, Alexa Curto, Lauren Dunn, Stephen Jawitz, Augustus Winks, and others. To begin, I would like to warmly welcome today's expert moderator, Stephen Jawitz, a principal at Beverage and Diamond. Steve's practice focuses on remediation and natural resources damages matters under the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act and similar state statutes imposing liability for hazardous substance releases. He also regularly addresses PCB cleanup issues under the Toxic Substances Control Act. Before joining Beverage and Diamond, Steve was with the Department of Justice, where he served closely with the EPA on CERCLA reauthorization. Steve, we're thrilled to have you here, and with that, I will turn things over to you.
Thank you very much, Caitlin. Our audience of over 250 today includes folks from all of the many sectors that are involved with and affected by the Superfund program: federal and state agencies, local governments, private companies, universities, law firms, consulting firms, private companies, and citizen groups. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining today. Let me note that this program is being recorded so others can view this session at their leisure. Well, here we are, 3 days before December 11th, 2020, the official 40th anniversary of the enactment of the CERCLA law. The first CERCLA 40 program in October focused on the first major set of program modifications that occurred as a result of the 1986 SARA amendments. This panel, in contrast, will focus on subsequent changes in the Remedial Action Program in particular, and current pressures that may lead to future changes. CERCLA was enacted with the vision that eventually cleanups of past waste disposal sites would come to an end and other statutes would take over moving forward, like the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. Despite that, 40 years later, there are still well over 1,000 sites on the national priorities list. Both the size and cost of remedial actions continue to grow. Hordes of lawyers like me are still employed in dealing with federal, state, and private party claims, and CERCLA disputes are still ending up in the US Supreme Court. So I'm confident in saying that the Superfund program shows no signs of ending anytime soon. But the program is continuing to change, and I'm honored to have with me today 3 people who are highly qualified to talk about those changes. Peter Wright, who is the current Assistant Administrator of the Office of Land and Emergency Management, the name of which changed from the Office of Solid Waste and Emergency Response, or OSWR, almost exactly 5 years ago, in December 2015. Peter's been an environmental lawyer for over 30 years, and he worked both in law firms and as in-house counsel before joining EPA in July 2018 as special counsel to the administrator. Peter was confirmed as Assistant Administrator in July 2019. Over the years, he's also held a number of leadership positions in the ABA section on environment, energy, and natural resources. We also have Maddie Stanislaus, who is currently Interim Director of the Global Battery Alliance and the World Economic Forum. He was the Assistant Administrator for OLEM throughout the Obama administration. He's an environmental lawyer and chemical engineer with over 15 years leadership experience in the private, government, and nonprofit sectors, fostering community-driven approaches to align social and environmental justice with economic considerations. And we have with us Tim Fields, who currently serves as Senior Vice President in MDB Inc., leading their environmental justice and facilitation activities. Tim has incredibly deep experience at EPA, spending about 30 excuse me, 30 years of his career there, eventually serving as assistant administrator for the Office of Land and Emergency Management, then known as OSWR, during the Clinton administration. I'd like to kick this off with a discussion of Superfund program changes related to the beneficial reuse of sites and the related focus on community revitalization. What has changed and what are the future trends? Let's start with Tim.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you for hosting and moderating this important panel, and glad to be a part of the panel with this great group. In terms of redevelopment and reuse at Superfund sites, it's something that for the first 15 to 20 years of the Superfund program, it was not a real priority. It's not something we focused on. Obviously, our main focus during the initial years was protecting public health and the environment, trying to accelerate cleanup of Superfund sites through construction completions, and trying to implement administrative reforms. And that was the primary focus and the job that remedial project managers were concerned about in the field. In 1995, there was a real push by the U.S. Conference of Mayors to address lesser contaminated sites called brownfields. So EPA announced a brownfields redevelopment initiative that year and began to assess, clean up, and redevelop those lesser contaminated sites across the country. So those of us at EPA during that time, we said, hey, you know, there's no reason why reuse and redevelopment could not be occurring at these Superfund sites as well. So we began to do a few pilot projects to look at how we could reclaim and reuse Superfund sites after cleanup. And in 1999, we announced the Superfund Redevelopment Initiative, addressing the reuse and redevelopment of Superfund sites during and after cleanup. That initiative turned out to be very successful. It has grown over the years to now more than 600 of the sites on the national priorities list have had significant reuse and redevelopment activity that has occurred at those sites. That includes, you know, ballparks, manufacturing facilities, healthcare facilities, all types of reuses, solar power facilities. Those have all been occurring at these sites called Superfund sites. So the brownfields model that we adopted in 1999 at Superfund sites has shown us that we can do our primary job, which is protecting public health and the environment at Superfund sites, but also we can also address important reuse, redevelopment, and reclamation activities that can occur at these same sites while we're doing cleanup and while we're completing cleanup at these Superfund sites. So I think that redevelopment will continue at these sites. It has grown over the years, and I believe that as we continue to clean up, reuse Superfund sites, it will be an important addition and benefit to communities and the public at large as we clean up the sites, protect public health and the environment, and reclaim these valuable properties at the same time. So I think that that's important, and it's something that we should continue to do as a Superfund program body, if you will. So I'll stop there, Steve.
Maddie, could you give us some of your thoughts?
Yeah, sure. I would say building upon the leadership that Tim articulated and laid the groundwork for. You know, one of the memos that Tim, whether you recall, is how do you align a remedy selection with end use determination? You know, it sounds like a simple topic, but it's quite a complex topic if you're going to do it authentically. You know, and so one of the things that building on Tim's leadership is how do you foster a community-led process to identify community preferences for future site use, particularly in the context of the surrounding neighborhoods. So these neighborhoods tend to have disproportionately blight conditions, tend to have high unemployment, tend to have environmental justice communities, environmental justice circumstance, pollution loading. So one is focusing on aligning the agency's job of remedy selection with the leadership of local leaders in terms of aligning with existing and future land use of the community. But also focusing on redevelopment and cleanup, again, in the context of the neighborhood. During my time, fostering what we called area-wide planning to look at a kind of a community-driven process in the brownfields program, so that you can look at the neighborhood in context, the end use in the context of the neighborhood, and also the associated infrastructure investments, which at those sites there was a history of disinvestment in infrastructure. How do you look at that nexus of redeveloping in a way that really stimulates the neighborhood? Building on that, and I think a crossover from the Brownfield Superfund program is looking at kind of the value add of the federal investment in terms of the economic and local job benefit, and unbeknownst to most people, Superfund investment and Brownfield investment are a significant investment multiplier. We did a number of rigorous studies done independently that showed for every dollar, it results in a significant multiplier in the brownfield sites, anywhere from $10 to $15 of private investment or other associated public and local investment, but also increasing of property values, from a 10 to 20% in property values. And so, it is looking at redevelopment in the context, one of the neighborhood, and also in the context of the stimulus effect it can have when we align with local leadership in terms of end use planning and the underlying conditions that are necessary to have the redevelopment serve community needs. I'll stop there.
Let me ask a quick question, because in the private sector, of course, there is a lot of interest in the concept of identifying appropriate future uses under the heading of reasonably anticipated future use for a Superfund site in order to figure out, in part, the cleanup standards question. Do you see a tension in working with the community about identifying its future interests with respect to potential future use of a piece of property, such as for light recreation, for example, and the possibility that ends up with tailoring cleanup standards to that future use, which might be different cleanup standards than if it was going to be residential. Do you see any tension there, or do you see it actually working out pretty well in terms of how you explain that to the community?
Well, yeah, I can jump in. I mean, I think it could be done in a seamless way, or it can be done in a tense way, to be honest, right? So, authenticity of determining not only what's on the books in terms of existing land use plans, but what is the forecast. And many of these areas, they're also the subject of broad redevelopment planning. So it could be a mixture of recreational, commercial uses. And my view has always been it's that the cleanup needs to follow the local development determination and not the reverse. And frankly, the reverse has happened, where cleanup decisions were made not fully cognizant of the local land use decision making, and basically restricts the future redevelopment, future wishes of that neighborhood.
Steve, I would add to what Maddie just said. I agree with what Maddie said. I think that you have to work with all parties involved together. The community has to be involved. The responsible parties have to be involved. But I think you can work together to address all the issues around future anticipated land use, make sure that the reuse that's being contemplated is community driven. And I've been involved in several sites, still working on them today, where the responsible parties, the community, the federal government and the state government have all been working together as a team to help effectuate reuse and redevelopment at those properties. So I think it can work, but everybody has to be at the table and everybody has to be talking to one another.
And I would certainly agree with, what Matthew and Tim were just saying. And, as I see it, I mean, thinking about future reuse really does, I think, help in a lot of community engagement. I mean, sometimes our community engagement, I think, comes across as pretty obtuse if it's too focused on the Superfund program, the process steps. I mean, a lot of communities, they want to know kind of how long things are going to take, what's going to happen. The way I often look at redevelopment is again, it can help at the beginning by doing some degree of focusing on, where are we targeting, what are we trying to achieve. I think it's very effective in the middle of a lot of cleanups, because once the community is expecting that the future of the Superfund site is going to be a park or a manufacturing facility or a shopping mall, there's a lot of community pressure and interest in sort of seeing that move along, and that's, that redevelopment is often much more understandable and visible to the community, so that they don't see that going in, that you're going to hear from them. And then I think it helps at the end. I think one of the challenges that is a perennial challenge for the Superfund program is the long-term stewardship situation. And again, while we have a number of tools at our disposal to address the long-term stewardship, I don't think any of them work as well as having kind of the long-term ownership of an operation of property aligned with whatever the appropriate longer-term environmental controls, if there are any. So, but Tim, one thing I'll say about the Superfund redevelopment initiative, kudos to you for starting it. Last year, for the 20th celebration, I was asked to review a report about it, and my response was, I'd never heard of it. I'm very familiar with redevelopment, and this led me to counsel the folks, is because they would always refer to it as SRI, and my recommendation is, for things we want to promote, do not use acronyms. Talk about Superfund redevelopment. People would know what you're talking about. As you've said, there have been incredibly impressive, results. I kind of suggest that, I don't know if it's still an initiative 20 years later, but again, it's a critical part of I think the program, from here into the future horizon.
So Steve, if I can add one other finer point, it's financial underwriting, right? Depending on the nexus of the cleanup and redevelopment, you could actually result in imposing costs on the redevelopment that makes the redevelopment not happen or happen in the right way. So for example, depending on the extent of cleanup or the barrier and how that relates to redevelopment, you could be effectively imposing financial costs on the redevelopment that may make it impossible. So that's kind of a finer point that is lost on a lot of people, having worked with the banking industry. So that's a crucial element of this intersection of land use and remedy selection.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that additional point. I'd like to move to what I'd consider an adjacent or closely related topic. And you already mentioned it in passing. When did environmental justice really start getting attention in the Superfund program? And is that aspect of the program continuing to change in significant ways? What do you see as its future? Let's start with Maddie on that one. Sure.
I would say it really happened under the leadership of Tim and Elliot Laws. My recollection is that it began with community leaders who served in the National Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, who initially brought up the crucial issues of environmental justice. As I recall, it was initially acutely brought to fore in the relocation of communities. I believe Escambia was one of them, but a few other where the issues, deep, tough issues about exposure and the tough decision about relocating community, which is the history, in some cases, multi-generational issues. So it's really complex about place, about defining communities, exposure, and the tough decisions about relocating as the only way of protecting neighborhoods, which stimulates a lot of a conversation. And Then the other what was this effort on the Waste and Facility Siting Subcommittee. I think both were done under that siting subcommittee of the NEJAC, but it was something that Charles Lee led, which was a conversation with communities around the country around brownfields. You know, and the takeaway was you have to focus in on the disproportionate impacts, not just of the site, but the associated neighborhoods. You know, the fact is that these sites are a reflection of disinvestment, of blight. You know, looking at those issues, but also the benefit of the neighborhoods. You know, in fact, I think the issue that Tim took on was the fact that neighborhoods were saying, you know, we're seeing the cleanup, we're seeing the federal government investing, but we're not getting the benefit of it in terms of the cleanup itself. So under Tim's leadership, at the beginning of the job training program, so you can train people from the neighborhood to partake in a benefit from the cleanup itself. You know, and I think it fundamentally shifted the paradigm of the Superfund program, you know, from a transactional construction program to a form of a community-centered program. You know, and this is something that I did. We added a lot of kind of metrics to the Superfund program. So, you know, the majority of the population within 3 miles of a Superfund site are disproportionate minority, low income, linguistically isolated, and less likely to have a high school education as compared to the US population as a whole. So the surrounding conditions are crucial for a Superfund site. So building upon the great work of the community engagement program, which recognized that community engagement is crucial to the success and buy-in of the local community, doing extensive outreach, fostering local leadership in the process, things like multilingual presentations, even things like fish advisories, making sure it is presented both in an understandable way and the language for folks to understand. Technical assistance providers, having an assistance provider to serve on behalf of, to be the trusted advisor to communities in making these tough, difficult technical decisions. So, you know, from my perspective, the Superfund program is one of the agency's core environmental justice aligned program, or environmental justice needs to be a core of its consideration.
Tim, why don't we hear from you now?
Thanks, Steve. And I appreciate Maddie's remarks, because Maddie was the guy who pushed me a lot on environmental justice issues when he was a member of the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council. And I was initially Deputy Assistant Administrator and then later Assistant Administrator of OSWER during the 1990s. And we worked together on a lot of tough issues, including Superfund matters. So I commend Maddie on his job. I never thought that he would one day become the assistant administrator for at EPA. But it really started a lot by the passage and enactment of the 1994 Executive Order on Environmental Justice. It required all federal agencies to address environmental justice as a major issue in their programs, policies, and activities. So in 1995, in OSWER, we developed the first environmental justice strategy that was endorsed by the NEJAC. And we were very proud about that, but it addressed environmental justice in programs like Superfund and others that we were managing at the time. The program, as Maddie said, is integral to many communities, because many Superfund sites, as Peter and all know, are located right next to and close proximity to communities with major environmental justice concerns, at-risk populations. So we have continued to address this issue. Maddie mentioned the relocation for the first time in Escambia, the Pensacola, where we relocated 350 residents around African-American residents around 2 Superfund sites back in the 1990s and early 2000s. That has continued. For the last 20 years, as a private consultant, I have worked with several communities like Spartanburg, South Carolina, where we have 2 Superfund sites, one called the Arkwright Landfill, another called the IMC site owned by Mosaic. And we're working with 2 primarily African-American communities to effectuate cleanup, but also we're in the process of implementing major redevelopment of those sites, working with the community. The reuses are community-driven, working with the responsible parties, the federal government and state government on those projects. At one site, we're going to be creating a solar power facility. At the other, we'll be creating a major aquaponics facility for sustainable fishing and vegetable growing at the site. So I think, as Maddie said earlier, I think environmental justice will continue to be a critical component of addressing Superfund sites in the future. And I think that it is a great way to address environmental justice concerns in communities where these sites exist. And I'll stop there.
Peter, do you think these, do you see a continuing trend or change, or do you view that aspect of the program as sort of continuing the way it's been continuing recently?
Well, I would certainly see it as continuing. I think for the reasons that Tim and Matthew indicated. I mean, the majority of our Superfund sites probably are in environmental justice communities, certainly the land-based ones. And I think it's clear that the commitment is very ingrained, I think, within the career staff here at EPA, and the impact of the work, and there's a real appreciation for the impact and the importance of the work that we do. One thing that I hope it continues to be a thought is the thought that justice delayed is justice denied. That's a further reason to pick up the pace. Let me give you an example of, I think, one of the ways in which that we've been doing some work to pick up the pace, and that is in certain communities, there's been a preference for undertaking work, particularly with respect to lead cleanup, using a series of removal actions, because frankly, that just proceeds much faster than the whole process of having to list the site, which of course is its own administrative procedure, and then go through the Superfund the stepwise process, where again, it's in a case typically of a residential lead situation, the path forward is pretty clear. That the lead contaminated soil needs to be removed. One thing I've been discussing with the staff is to look even more broadly, and I hope the agency continues to think about this, is to consider for example, in the context of lead, other sources of exposure. So for example, our algorithm for calculating the lead soil removal assumes that there's some level of exposure from drinking water and from house lead dust. And when I started discussing about, well, instead of calculating, using that to determine how much soil, more soil, or what soil level to use, why don't we take a look at that? Take a look at, if people are being exposed, and it's probably often the case in old substandard housing, that there could very well be a problem with the pipes, with the lead dust. Why don't we address that as well? That's a bit of a challenge because it kind of crosses the different EPA programs, and maybe some of it even pushes a bit beyond EPA. But I hope the agency continues to look at that. And there, I think there's certainly some interest in doing that, and then some sort of institutional reluctance because people think, well, that's another program. But I hope that continues to be an emphasis, is that when EPA goes in there, if we have to bring some other federal agencies with us, let's do that, and bring the state and the city, and let's really take care of the problem. And consider the Superfund program's 40 years old. Why are there lead sites? I mean,
yeah, I mean, in a sense, you're talking about taking it from what, as Maddie termed it, a construction program, and thinking more broadly about public health. But you're right, we've seen that there are certainly constraints on what Superfund money can be spent on. And they're not able to deal with a drinking water issue with that program, for example. So somebody else has to come in and help solve the problem. Now, just a quick follow-up, technical assistance grants were created to try to help communities understand better what was going on with the Superfund program. Each of your experiences, have you seen technical assistance grants really been very significantly used, or because of the restrictions on applying for and getting and managing grants, has it really not been a significant player? Peter, have you seen much about technical assistance grants in your experience?
You know, I've actually not so much since I've been at the agency. I can't think that questions have come up. I guess in my prior practice experience, some. You know, I guess my impression is that the effectiveness, it probably has a lot to do with the particular community, the particular situation, and the particular consultant. I don't think I've formed any broad conclusions. You know, so just real quickly, and I'll turn it over. I mean, there has, you know, Andrew Wheeler, the current administrator, has emphasized from the get-go, you know, the need for the agency to improve its risk communication. And so, well, you know, so again, maybe I'm diverting a little bit here, but there really is a lot of work underway to try to become more effective from the agency standpoint. That I'm not saying that replaces technical assistance grants, but I think that would be, if the agency could really be more effective, that would be probably a greater level of consistency than probably maybe what I've just personally observed with the application of technical assistance grants. Not a substitute.
Maddie, Tim, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would agree with Peter that, you know, I think the Superfund program needs to begin with, you know, more simply communicating what the program does or does not. And I've always said, you know, people don't need to know the underlying epidemiology to know the differences between terminating a pathway of exposure and the health consequences, right? So simplifying that language. But I do think that technical assistance grants are important, particularly on complex sites, you know, where it relates in terms of the complexity of the remedy, the interface with land use selection. So I think it's really, I've seen it really beneficial in doing so. Clearly there's some administrative questions, one making sure that the technical assistance provider is competent, but also serves as a neutral technical assistance communicator, and frankly not an advocate. It's the communities that has to be the advocate. But also one of the things that we took on is the fact is some communities, be it community groups or local governments, may not have the capability to actually effectively put together a package, you know. So, I mean, there's more on the brownfield side. So we establish technical assistance centers around the country where they can help assist, in this case of grants, but it could equally apply for technical assistance grants to better enable, be it academic institutions or others, to better compete for and administer technical assistance grants.
Just to add briefly to what Peter and Maddie just said, technical assistance grants have been used for a number of years. They're still being used today, and they can be a very effective tool for use by communities to better understand what is happening at the site, particularly if you pick the right technical assistance advisor. That's critical. Some technical assistance advisors are not, you know, the right person for a particular site. And so it has to be a good choice of that technical assistance resource for the community. I think one thing we need to work on in the future is making it easier for people to apply for and obtain technical assistance grants. Sometimes it can be too bureaucratic, and I've heard community organizations complain about the amount of paperwork involved in trying to apply for and obtain a technical assistance grant from the agency to assist them in being involved and getting in, and being aware of what's happening at a site in their community. So I think that's an area we need to work on. But I think technical assistance grants can continue to be an effective tool for involving communities in the decision-making process at Superfund sites.
Now, of course, technical assistance grants cost money, and let's talk about money a little bit and adaptation to budget circumstances. The federal Superfund budget's been flat for a very long time. It's really become, it seems, a fundamental feature of the program. State budgets, occasionally they're in good shape, but often they're under severe pressure, as today, for example. What impact does the level of resources have at the state and federal level on the future implementation of the Superfund program? Can it really succeed in the way that everybody wants it to succeed? And why don't we start with Peter on that easy question?
Right. Well, I'll be mindful of some of what I say as the one sitting government official about, about budgets. So that, as obviously that's a current subject of discussion here in Washington, D.C. So I'm not going to lobby on behalf of budgets. And I'll commend Kate Probst, who wrote a paper for ELI, right? Actually discusses, the topic of federal funding over a period of time, and I think in conjunction with Superfund at 40. So it talks quite a bit about that. So we've been obviously focused on doing better with the appropriations we get. I mean, there's an obvious relationship between the ability to fund particular projects at sites, depending on the available funding, and we can talk certainly about the challenges that the states have. Just to offer a little bit of a contra thinking, I mean, funding certainly is important, and there's a relationship between some of what gets done or what can be funded and the amount of funds. But there are other challenges that the Superfund program has with respect to funding, and something we've been working on. So, and the example I would give is, there's Tronix in its bankruptcy, was obliged to create a considerable settlement, all over the settlements and special accounts EPA has for, is over $1 billion related to the, abandoned uranium mines in the West and on the Navajo Nation's lands. And, even in that, where there's a lot of money there, there have been definitely challenges in the ability and frustrations on behalf of the Navajos, Congress, and certainly within EPA about the ability to fund it. So, and I'm sure, Tim and Matthew will have a lot to say about funding, but I would suggest that, there's still work to be done, with respect to the way EPA manages projects and engages that are not directly related to just how much funding we have. And it's certainly a concern that I see from states being underfunded, that there are very, very few sites, I believe, that we've listed on the national priorities list or proposed, which haven't sort of gone through a series of progressions of what I would almost kind of call failures, right? It's not like, I think it's probably been a while since somebody just suddenly came across, in the forest, the Valley of Drums. Most sites have had problems. Many of the sites that get listed on the NPL were subject of EPA removal actions, or they were under state cleanup programs. And it's sort of the inability, I think, in many cases to sort of address some of the sites earlier that are, I think, certainly one cause, it would appear, of sites continuing to finally having to come onto the national priorities list because they've either gotten worse, the states can't address them. EPA's Superfund program is kind of the program of last resort. So there's a lot that we could talk about funding and budgeting.
Tim?
Just to add to what Peter said, Superfund funding has been a problem for a number of years, and it cuts across both Democratic and Republican administrations in terms of this issue of not having adequate funding. During the early 20 years, first 20 years of the Superfund program, particularly as we had a trust fund, which expired at the end of 1995, we had more than $2 billion a year that we were spending on Superfund cleanups during the 1990s. And we were able to get more than 80 construction completions a year. As the funding began to dry up and we were able to get more like a little over $1 billion a year for Superfund cleanup, we've seen the impact of the reduction in funding on Superfund program activity. The number of construction completions have declined. We found that we can't always get construction underway at all the sites that we have planned for a particular year. We can't provide as much resource to the states for their involvement in the remediation process with EPA. There are a lot of impacts of having a lesser amount of funding. So I hope that as a new administration comes in, that there is an ability or a desire to restore the amount of funding for the Superfund program, because I think the lack of adequate funding right now does hinder the ability of the Superfund program to have all the staff they need, implement all the priorities they want, and facilitate getting sites cleaned up and reused at the same time. So I think it's a problem. It's a problem that's been around for a long time, and I hope that working with Congress, that the EPA will be able to get Superfund funding restored to a high level in the future, beyond what it is today.
Well, Maddie, if in fact the program budget follows past history, and when I say history, I mean decades of fairly flat funding, how do you think the program can and should adapt to that?
Well, I mean, total due respect, I think that's a wrong question. I think it's important to take a step back and look at the demands on the Superfund program. During my time, coming out of 2007, 2008 recession, we had a time before then, the states had in their budget significant resources in many states to do cleanup. That just dried up, right? So we saw a huge rise of sites that would have been done with state versions of cleanup programs that all dried up. And frankly, there are less and less champions for funding this at the state and federal level. So there's a cumulative net loss of funds. And I think there's a shared responsibility between the public, between federal and state government leaders, to really look at the importance of investing this at an adequate amount. We do not have an adequate amount today, as reflected by the pipeline that Peter is probably pretty well aware of. Fact is that we have construction starts that cannot start, because we do not have resources, right? And so what does that mean? So during my time, we did a couple of independent studies. We fostered independent studies. Now I referenced the return of investment economically, right? So land use values increasing, jobs return. But let's talk about the public health consequences, right? So there was a study done by a couple of universities that shows that, delayed cleanup means increased health consequences. So we did a study of the incidence of congenital anomalies in the infants of mothers living with 2,000 meters of a site, and that could increase 20 to 25% if there was delay in cleanup, right? So there's a huge need to reorient the need for investing in this properly. So I will say, the money is necessary to deal with that, but there's also the issue of orphan sites. That's what we're really talking about, where we don't have a responsible party addressing these sites. And to be honest, the lack of financial assurance is a crucial part of it, and I've disagreed with the recent decision to not require financial assurance in a number of the sectors under Circular Section 108B, right? So financial assurance is part and parcel of the Superfund program, where people delink it, right? Financial assurance, in a sense, requires the business operation to build that into the cost of doing business. And I would argue it drives better performance by companies so that they do not have the contamination, right? So I strongly believe that we need to have an equally vigilant focus on financial assurance during the operations of businesses, as much as that we need to have a adequately funded Superfund program. And I just want to bust one big myth that the Superfund is a legacy program. I mean, during my time, a huge percentage, I don't know, was 40 or 50%, was sites that were recently closed operations. So this myth that the Superfund program is only dealing with sites that are closed 20 and 30 years ago is factually not correct. So we have this huge introduction into the Superfund program of recently closed sites that became orphan or subject to bankruptcy proceedings. So again, I would argue that financial assurance, adequate financial assurance, drives better behavior, reduces the pressure on the federal budget, in terms of having an adequate funding. And the last thing I will say is that, I mean, listen, we do need a Superfund tax to make sure there's dedicated resources for the Superfund program. Otherwise, Superfund is competing with every other priority in the federal government. I'll stop there.
Well, following up on that, you all have the pleasure and honor of minding not only the Superfund program, but the RCRA program. If you could just take a couple minutes to explain why you think RCRA financial assurance, there are extensive financial assurance requirements under RCRA, why that hasn't really dealt with the issue of recent failures leading to a lot of new cleanup work.
Well, I'll just say something about the RCRA. The RCRA program, financial assurance, applies to facilities, well, interim status, which I'm surprised that there's some, but certainly predominantly to, permitted treatment, storage, and disposal facilities, right? Which are actually comparatively a small percentage, right, of the businesses in the United States. So that does apply to, to those businesses that are in if you will, in the hazardous waste management business. There are obviously many other sites that handle hazardous substances, that wouldn't be subject to RCRA financial assurance. For example, one not uncommon kind of a site, and I'm not advocating anything particularly with it. I'll just point out is there sites that have been made that are making the list that are relatively small businesses. They're former dry cleaners that went out of business. The little bitty machine shop that sometimes they're located in neighborhoods where I suspect nobody knew there was some sort of a commercial business. Small metal plating shops. So for example, none of those sorts of businesses would be subject to federal based, RCRA corrective action, financial assurance, and actually some of them, not based on a lot of RCRA regulation.
Okay, comments from Patty or Tim on that?
Tim, would you like to go first?
I'll pass.
Okay. Well, I think we take a step back, and I would say every leading business that I deal with, there's a commitment to ESG, the environmental, social, and governance requirements, and translating that into their bottom line, and the fact is that the leading businesses and actually some of the leading financiers, BlackRock, are all driving more accountability, data-driven, into building into their business, right? So I think we should take a harder look at, the fact is that RCRA financial assurance has been found wanting in a number of pretty significant circumstances. I remember in the auto recovery scenario, we had a number of sites that had inadequate financial assurance, right? So, whether it's RCRA or 108B, the fact is that we need to drive those businesses to make sure they have adequate financial resources should something run afoul, right? And what I found in this debate is people got stuck with the nature of the financial instrument and the consequences in financial markets from the base obligation to have adequate resources. Large businesses, should be able to do it more readily, and maybe there is a different instrument where there's more of a pooled instrument. But to me, not to deal with the need for business of all sizes to have assurance of financing to deal with what economists call the externality of their operations and internalize that into the context of their business. To me, that lessens the pressure on a Superfund program. It lessens the pressure of taxpayers paying for cleanup. I'll stop there.
Steve, I'll add one quick point that tangentially mentions what your question is. I think there needs to be a broader discussion about the funding of contaminated sites in this country. In the budget for the last 15 or 20 years, Congress has provided $7 billion for DOE cleanup. Okay, they provided a little over $1 billion for Superfund cleanups administered, overseen by EPA. There's another several hundred $1 million that are going toward DOD cleanups. So I think that there needs to be an overall discussion as we go into a new year about what is the amount we're willing to spend on addressing these contaminated sites across the country. Not just funding, but enforcement activities, financial assurance. All those issues need to be part of the equation, and they need to be talked about in the context of other environmental priorities as well, like climate change and other issues that are coming to the fore in a big way. But I think that this funding is a big issue, and as Maddie and Peter and I have discussed, it has hindered the ability to do a lot of things that need to be dealt with at Superfund sites. But I think there needs to be a discussion about what is the relative priority we want to devote to this problem, so that we can decide what we're going to do with those resources that we decide to allocate toward Superfund versus RCRA versus DOE versus DOD, et cetera, moving forward.
And other vital programs like the funding,
Yep.
clean water and water treatment, where credit has to be provided to states. I mean, there are a long list of needs, and of course, working in the Superfund program, we often see a tension between the amounts of money being spent dealing with individual sites and not being devoted towards some of these broader community problems and issues that you've all mentioned. I will take the opportunity to use what you said, Tim, as a segue and ask about climate change, a topic that's on everybody's mind in the environmental community now and has been for some time. Over the last 40 years, EPA hasn't placed a lot of emphasis on the carbon intensity of various remediation approaches at sites. There certainly has been attention within EPA given first to green remediation and aspects of how do you implement a remedy in a more efficient and environmentally conscious way. Some of that was just from the outside looking in, looked like nibbling around the edges. More recently, EPA did issue guidance indicating that some of these more global issues like climate change could be considered and energy efficiency in the context of evaluating remedial alternatives. And I was wondering if you think EPA is in fact going to continue about the same or putting more pressure on the idea of the carbon intensity of different remediation approaches and making that more of an explicit part of the Superfund analysis, the feasibility study and remedy selection process.
Well,
there's also the adaptation question. We've seen a lot of sites hit with large incidents like hurricanes. But the first question is on the front end, the remedy selection end. So, Maddie, do you want to hit that one first?
Yeah, I guess I will start with adaptation and go to maybe I'll briefly mention mitigation. I mean, clearly there are opportunities to optimize a cleanup remedy, looking at ways of mitigation, be it clean energy options, be it clean energy vehicles on site. So all of those to be pursued, you know, and making sure that any of that pursuit doesn't compromise a remedy selection, right? So that's a couple of the guiding principles that we established during our time, and optimize it in a way that doesn't compromise remedy selection. But you know, per President Obama's 2013 executive order, you know, we established a comprehensive adaptation plan, and what it did is identified a number of key factors to be considered in the Superfund program. You know, looked at key concerns of permafrost fracturing, creating exposure pathways, extreme temperatures, you know, precipitation, event severity, flood risk, you know, obviously sea level, hurricanes, and even wildfires. You know, so during our time, my time, you know, we did the Superfund program staff did an evaluation of vulnerabilities from climate change. You know, I found, for example, that these climate change effects could result in issues regarding soil, sediment, and groundwater remedies involving technologies such as soil vapor extraction, bioremediation, pump and treat systems. So with a particular focus on those kind of remedies, and proximity, right? Proximity, you know, within 100 or 500-year floodplains, within a meter of a sea level rise, you know, doing an initial focus on those that are most vulnerable, both future cleanups and past cleanups, in place cleanups, and take a hard look at that, you know. So we establish an action plan, kind of a evaluation of remedies going forward with this in mind, looking at protocols for evaluating remedies that are in place in terms of the 5-year review process to make sure they continue to be protective. There are no risks associated with that. Identify specific remediation systems. I just cited a few that are likely to be impacted by climate change and how you should build that into your oversight, possibly changes to the remedy given potential consequences. And broadly build in these climate change considerations within the Superfund program. You know, but let me also mention that we also highlighted the need to look at, you know, what people don't normally associate with Superfund program, that is emergency response, right? So emergency response, what we identified is because of these events, you're likely going to need a different profile of a Superfund response infrastructure. You may need more or different equipment. You may need, I mean, because particularly the Superfund national program looks at kind of major events and multiple regional events. And from a deployment of infrastructure and staff, you know, we're essentially fighting the last fight. But we need to build the capabilities to fight the future fight. So it is likely that we're going to need to have greater resourcing to fight multiple of these events simultaneously. So building that infrastructure, not only at the federal level, but the state and local government level as well. Thank you.
Peter, do you see a change within EPA in terms of incorporating carbon intensity or energy efficiency into the more central role in the Superfund energy program, the Superfund remedy selection?
I may answer along the lines that Maddie did. That you know, what I've seen much more would be on the you know, actually, you know, what's happening on the ground, you know, which, you know, might come under the adaptation perspective. So, you know, we still have in place the 2016 guidance, you know, with respect to climate change and remedy selection. As pointed out, over the last 4 years, there have been, as I think everybody in the audience well knows, I mean, a very large number of large natural disasters, in terms of hurricanes, super typhoons, volcanic eruptions. I'm very proud to sort of serve alongside the colleagues in the emergency management office. One of the things that that EPA does is in advance, certainly of things like hurricanes and other predictable natural disasters. There's an assessment of sites, Superfund sites, and other kinds of sites in advance, right, of the hurricane landfall, and then an intensive amount of work that then follows afterwards to respond, assess, if necessary, clean up. So we have, well, it's certainly dozens of people still in the field, for example, in California, or all along the West Coast, addressing the impacts from wildfires. But one of the things that it sort of gives us is a lot of data on how well remedies have, how they've been impacted by, a large number of events. And it's pretty clear that, the remedies, by and large, are making it through these events. The kinds of damage that you see typically are, comparatively minor, particularly if there's some sort of work in progress that didn't maybe get fully shut down, or, structures like fences and pumps, things that are above ground. But, I think it's a testament to the, the EPA career personnel who are, frankly, very thoughtful in their design, either their design or their approval of designs of remedies. It is the case that certainly a lot of, maybe on the legacy side, Matthew, a lot of the legacies, if you will, chemical manufacturing and transportation facilities tend to be along water bodies, right? Because chemicals were the preferred method of shipment, was by barge. So, there are lots of facilities, lots of Superfund sites that near coast, they're on rivers, and again, I think the record reflects that the remedies are withstanding the impact, and at the same time, after any incident, the key is that is EPA learning about how well things came through, what could be improved upon, fix the next time. I think that's really critical. Is that we constantly evolve and constantly do a better job. But
did you have a comment there? Oh, sorry.
Sure. No.
Tim,
I'll just add a brief comment to what Maddie and Peter just said. There's a study on the way that I'm directing on behalf, Steve, of the Federal Interagency Working Group on Environmental Justice. We'll be coming out with their final report in June of 2021. For the last year, we've been looking at the impacts of natural disasters on communities and contaminated sites like Superfund sites. We've been looking at major flooding, hurricanes, wildfires across the country, and we'll be making findings and recommendations on how to better minimize some of those impacts in the preparedness, recovery, cleanup phases after natural disasters in this country. It's an important effort. We have 17 federal agencies involved in this effort, and I think that will have some significant impact on improving the situation going forward, including at major Superfund sites which are impacted a lot of times by major hurricanes, wildfires, major flooding, etc. Anyway, that's all I got.
Well, it's good to hear that both the attention's being paid to the issue and that so far it sounds like most sites are coming through natural disasters pretty well, which makes it sound like you're not necessarily going to see a lot of remedies being reopened under 5-year reviews to build in more resilience, if you will. Have you seen much of that where EPA has gone back and wanted to strengthen a remedy, change a remedy, given where it is and its potential vulnerability to a natural disaster? Is that not necessary?
I'll just say, I know that we look at that during 5-year reviews, but I'm not aware of any where it came up to my level of attention. So that it could very well, could be that somebody has made adjustments, but they don't tell me. I haven't heard it.
Hey,
But
yeah, I'm sorry, Peter, go ahead.
Go ahead.
So, yeah, I would say that I think it requires a dedicated and focused look, so begin with the Alaska sites and permafrost, right? So not to pick on DOD, but I will, So I think there's a belief that these in-place situations in Alaska, that the permafrost will serve as a permanent barrier. And I think there's a need for a comprehensive relook, at all of those sites. We do know that permafrost is fracturing. What we don't know is it fracturing to the point where it's creating exposure pathways directly to humans, indirectly to water sources? So I think it requires a dedicated program to look at permafrost kind of sites, look at, as the sites I mentioned, those in close proximity to waterways. And I almost think we need to develop a dedicated program for that, and I know that this is a funding issue, but I think that we need more data. We need dedicated data to really examine this question, to really make an informed judgment of whether the past remedies are holding up or they're not, whether particularly in-place remedies are holding up, so.
Thank you. A lot of the, we've been talking, of course, about the federal Superfund program, but particularly since the Superfund amendments were passed in 1986, there's been a defined role for states and tribes in the Superfund program. My question is whether you see that role changing in any way. Is it, in your view, is it worked out well at most sites? Are there things that you think can and should be improved going forward? And are there any, do you see any trends underway where that's changing? Why don't we start with Tim on that one?
Thanks, Steve. Superfund has existed over the years with an effective partnership between states and tribes in implementing the program. I don't see a lot of major changes in that partnership going forward. I believe that states will continue to play a major role in terms of providing monitoring, providing for implementation of institutional controls, reviewing and concurring on site remedies as they have in the past. And states will take the lead at certain sites where they're able. But I've talked to a lot of state officials, and they all say that they want the federal government, they want EPA and others to be able to bring their authority and capabilities to the table to assist and support them in those cases where the states are not able. So I believe that going forward, the Superfund partnership between EPA, states and tribes has worked. And I think it will continue to work that way in the future, because there will continue to be sites where states and tribes are not able to deal with the problem by themselves, and they will need the federal government to step in and provide support through their activities at those sites. Obviously, a big problem, and I don't want to go into this, we've already talked about it, is the lack of adequate funding. Obviously, all of us could do more if there was greater amount of funding provided for the program. More money would be available to EPA, to the states, tribes, others. But absent that increased funding, I think that the relationship will continue to exist pretty much as it has in the past.
Peter, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, so we, we regularly obviously speak with the states, individually on individual states, as well as just very recently with at SWAMO, with respect to, in the semi-annual meeting of the Superfund directors. And so I think, one thing that to follow up on some of what Tim was talking about, I don't sort of see a fundamental change taking place, but what I do see is states wanting, having an interest in maybe doing a bit more work at Superfund sites. I think, or different kinds of work. I mean, occasionally, the states do want to take the lead, but I would agree that I don't know that we see that happening necessarily a lot more. So I think building the state's capacity to be able to undertake more particular functions. I mean, one thing that we've seen certainly during the COVID situation is a high degree of variability in how well the states, and this is broader than a Superfund comment, how they were able to continue to, if you will, work remotely or address, the conditions of the pandemic, and that's pretty clearly highly variable. And clearly EPA, I think, was much more capable, and so I think that's hopefully on a kind of broader level. There's more thoughts about increasing the capability of states and to work under different conditions. Similarly with tribes, I guess one thing that we're seeing is some of the, tribes definitely want to be more engaged in many cases with the Superfund program, and including some tribes want to actually be able to do more of the work, maybe through cooperative agreements. Some of the larger tribes have certain, if you will, construction capabilities and are interested in doing that and being more engaged. So, I hope that continues, that, there's a continuing better relationship. But, sometimes there's difficulties, right, between states and EPA and EPA and tribes. So it's a partnership that probably a little bit waxes and wanes in terms of the way it moves forward.
Thank you very much. I think we have time to turn to one other topic briefly. And while this topic could be the subject of an all-day seminar in and of itself, the topic of megasites. And I ask it because I'm involved in some megasites. I suspect a number of the attendees to this webinar also are involved in megasites. One of the features of megasites is that you have so many different entities, PRPs and agencies involved, all trying to cope with each other. And the basic question, if you could spend a couple of minutes outlining whether you think EPA needs to change how it deals with some of these like huge river sites like Portland Harbor, or huge mining sites like Bunker Hill, the Coeur d'Alene River. Are there lessons learned from the past that you think can and will or should lead to changes in the future of how EPA addresses those sites? Peter, let's give it to you, since you're sort of sitting in the hot seat at the moment.
Okay, well, sure. Well, I actually want to briefly mention, one of the things that we have tried, that we've implemented that is new, and that is in September, we stood up a new office, the Office of Mountains, Deserts, and Plains, which once it's possible for people to move and relocate, will be based in Denver. And the focus there is on to address, to have a separate office reporting directly to the OLM Assistant Administrator that would address hard rock mining sites in the Western region. So regions 6 through 10. So those are, they're both hard rock mining sites. Certainly can be mega sites like the Bunker Hill sites, but in many cases, what we're looking, the hard rock mining sites are really almost watersheds, right? Where there's a number of abandoned mining sites. But this would also include the Navajo uranium sites, and that's certainly one response, is to provide special focus on a set of sites. that pose really, in many ways, fundamentally different issues than what we think of as sort of a traditional Superfund site. There's a little bit of difference from, the other kind of mega sites you were referring to, that these typically are not as typically ones where there are multiple PRPs. Actually, we're fortunate if there are any viable PRPs at many of these sites. As you said, we could speak all day about this. So I'll just highlight that because that's sort of a new response to a problem that struggles. We struggle to, and I could speak for quite a while about hard rock mining sites, but I'll let Tim and Matthew, I'll say view the rivers and the other things. So.
Yeah, Tim, do you want to tackle the river?
Thanks a lot, Peter. There are quite a few river sediment contamination sites that are being dealt with, whether you're talking Portland Harbor or Hudson River, many other sites. I did a little research, Steve, before this call, and I saw that there are more than 150 mega sites that have been put on the NPL. Maybe 1 in every 8 sites is a mega site. I did notice that there's been a trend where there are lesser numbers of mega sites being listed on the NPL, which tells me that people are trying to find different ways to address those sites, whether it's the special office that Peter mentioned with the mining sites out west, and all those sediment sites that exist in places like New Jersey, where you have a lot of mega sites that are the major river contamination issues that need to be remediated. And I think that this is something we need to look at, whether we can use other authorities in the future beyond Superfund to help address some of these mega sites. Look at the model of the Great Lakes National Program Office dealing with contaminated bodies on the Great Lakes. But I think we're going to have to find some different ways. I'm not sure Superfund was designed to deal with always being the first choice in dealing with major rivers, dealing with major 21 square mile mining sites like Bunker Hill and others in the Superfund program. So I think we're going to have to look at different kinds of mechanisms that can be utilized to supplement the Superfund program in dealing with these types of sites in the future.
Patty?
If I can add, so I think that mining sites, riverfront sites, so I think there is a technical complexity of legacy contamination with ongoing contamination. And so there's this nexus to Tim and Peter's point of, what is the best program to deal with that? Yeah. And now I found out, whether it's Portland Harbor or Hudson River, it dealt directly with that technical issue, and so, I signed off of a memo with the AF Water is that how to, more directly deal with Clean Water Act consent order obligations and Superfund settlement agreement obligations. I mean, in a sense, there's a little bit of technical conflict because of the temporal nature, right? So you have the clean water infrastructure, which is bonded for 10, 20 years, and the program of 10, 20 years, you have ongoing contamination. So that's a real unique complexity. On the mining side, similarly, you have a water, if you're looking at contamination in a watershed, it's a contribution from multiple mining sites. Around the Colorado River, you have multiple kind of exposures, So I do think it's worthwhile taking a step back, what should be the best approach for that? I would note that there is a financial assurance issue with this as well. During my time, we pushed forward our hard rock mining financial assurance program, which I still believe in, right? We simply cannot have the circumstance where you have mining companies going bankrupt and having a business model. We're only going to do create a shell to do an individual site without adequate financial assurance to deal with the obligations. And the last thing I will mention, I think comes up in Portland Harbor, is the nexus towards waterfront redevelopment, right? And so it played out in Portland Harbor. So there's this whole issue of local government playing multiple roles. Like one is the redevelopment authorities want to foster redevelopment. On the other hand, the municipalities on the hook for long-term clean water obligations, as well as being a responsible party. So local government is actually wearing multiple of hats, which also complicates the resolution of issues. You know, I don't necessarily have an answer to that. Okay.
Yeah. Like I said, we could spend, and probably at some point should schedule, an all-day seminar to really delve into some of those issues more. As we move toward wrapping up the main part of this and moving into a few minutes for audience questions, I'd like to ask each of you to shine up your crystal balls and just spend a minute telling our listeners, will the next administration basically stay on course with the Superfund program or set a new heading? Maddie, let's start with you.
Yeah, sure. I think they're probably going to reinforce a couple of things I mentioned. You know, the climate adaptation, emphasis on that, the environmental justice, community leadership issue. The one thing that I didn't mention that we started during my time is the nexus on fostering clean energy. You know, so we fostered a relationship with NREL to analyze sites around the country with greatest potential for siting clean energy. Just the nature of these long, I would say, in-place remedy sites. They happen to be in close proximity with transmission corridors. So you have this interesting nexus of clean energy. And so I expect not only from a clean energy that one of the major opportunities of clean energy is actually utility scale storage. You know, so it's going to be interesting opportunities, I think, in terms of linking, you know, these large sites, which may not lend itself for other kinds of redevelopment, to be the place for energy storage. And this is the space I'm currently involved in. Fixed energy storage is a fundamental game changer because it shifts renewable energy from an episodic source to a reliable source, and then it then are able to change the whole energy mix from more renewable energy towards fossil fuel energy. So I expect that to be a major emphasis of the new administration.
Thanks, Maddie. Tim, what do you think?
I'll be brief. I think every administration comes in feeling they can do the job better than the prior administration. So I expect that the new administration will come in and say they're going to reform Superfund and make it work better and faster and cheaper in the future with a new set of administrative reforms. They will work with Congress to try to increase the budget that we've talked about here on this call, this discussion for the Superfund program. And given the priorities, as Maddie said earlier, I think that they will try to incorporate more focus on climate change and environmental justice into the Superfund program going forward. I'll stop there.
Okay, Peter, you want to take a shot at it?
Sure. Well, even to be maybe briefer, I hope that, you know, there's the continued, you know, recognition for the importance of the Superfund program, you know, along with the Brownfields program or corrective action program, in really having impact in transforming communities, and knowing that you know, moving with speed is important, and we've initiated some, you know, management tools, which are lean management tools, which I think, you know, if kind of stuck with and committed to, you know, will have the benefit of helping greatly the administration of all of our cleanup programs, and hope they continue.
Well, thank you very much, gentlemen, for your insights and for your contributions. We really appreciate the opportunity to hear from you and to talk with you. Caitlin, I'd like to turn it back to you to see if we have an audience question we can answer.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Opening up the questions now, and as a reminder, everyone, you can enter your questions using GoTo's question box. So we'll start with one from earlier in the program. A participant says that she has a question for Peter. What does the Trump administration want its legacy to be in terms of Superfund changes or accomplishments?
Okay, well, I mean, again, so I'll say this. I think that, you know, that we focused on it. We focused on, you know, accelerating cleanup. We focused on, you know, getting sites, you know, back into reuse as quickly as possible. We've definitely focused on deleting sites from the national priorities list to get that accomplished, because only EPA can follow through the process. We've actually even improved the process for site deletions. And so, you know, that I think that, you know, our legacy, we hope is that, you know, and that is of, you know, protecting public health and the environment, while also, you know, providing, you know, more land for communities to use to their, you know, their best advantage.
Thank you so much. We have a question for Maddie. One of our participants asks if you believe the Biden administration should relaunch and expand the area-wide planning grant program that has recently been shuttered, as it yielded positive outcomes for overburdened communities.
Yes, 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 and yes. You know, I think that the area-wide planning program, I think, was viewed as a very huge success. It brought communities to the table to lead. The leveraging of the cleanup of a site to a broader redevelopment, and what we found is it also led to huge multipliers of infrastructure investments. In fact, we partnered with the Department of Transportation to provide priority and preference to Tiger grants. So absolutely, I'm a big believer in the area-wide planning program, and I would actually go further. I think there's an opportunity in terms of linking it with clean energy infrastructure with the brownfield sites.
Thank you. I have another question that I will pose to the group. A participant notes that clean enough is critical. Getting to a cleanup that the community thinks is protective is usually a key point that stops or delays cleanup/reuse. What can the panelists suggest to overcome this conundrum? Thank you.
I'll start. How clean is clean always has been an issue in Superfund remediation. I think that we need to make sure that we're applying the best science risk assessment to remediation, work with the community to get them involved, maybe with a technical assistance advisor. Make sure that as we implement cleanup, we help the community understand that we're providing the greatest degree of cleanup possible at the site in their community, and that therefore they can get engaged in activities regarding possible reuse of that property after cleanup is completed.
So I will add to that and completely agree with Tim. In terms of the actual remedy itself, it's a mixture of the actual cleanup, for example, of soils, of water, but also in-place remedies, right? So making sure that these in-place remedies are protective long-term, are integrated with the redevelopment scheme. Yeah, the financial and legal mechanism to make sure they're protective long-term is an equally important part of the cleanup standard question.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question, and there's a lot of good ones in here, so thank you all for your patience. One of our participants asks, regarding Maddie's point that many Superfund sites are new, and given the authority of RCRA and elsewhere within EPA statutes, how is it that new sites can be introduced into Superfund? Where is the gap that prevents these sites from being addressed earlier?
Well, I will go, you know, I think it is, as you said, is that, you know, the RCRA program, financial assurance program, is to enable the access to financial instruments so that you do not have to revert to the Superfund program, right? So the more that we can build in adequacy of those resources, one, But two, when you talk to kind of corporate leaders who are doing this well, is that it drives better corporate performance. Essentially prevents mismanagement. Some of the whether it's mining sites or manufacturing sites, the more that it's integrated into your bottom line, the more that changes and improves performance, and bringing more visibility to that, I think is good. So again, I think you want to avoid Superfund as the first principle and have that built into the operations of the business.
Well, but I'll offer up that I think the data would show that a lot of, again, a disproportionate number of the newer sites are much smaller businesses, that have not typically been subject, to the degree of regulation of, what we were talking about earlier, record treatment, storage, and disposal facilities. These are smaller businesses, and so they're, they're not caught, by the mainline laws that are, designed to focus on larger manufacturing sites. So that's it's another issue.
Back with the states, perhaps. Caitlin, again, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. A big, enormous thank you to all of our outstanding panelists. To you, Steve, we're so appreciative of all of you sharing your expertise with us for today's webinar. I do want to also thank our participants for joining us and for your great questions. I hope you all stay safe and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks all.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Stay safe.
Bye.
Good to see you. Bye-bye.